The Alpha King froze at her scent in the crowded hall. He was Thane, the Wolf Lord of the North, a king carved from granite and glaciers, and he did not freeze. Not for assassins, not for armies, not for anything. But now, on his high throne of iron and weirwood, he went utterly still, a predator catching a scent on the wind that defied all logic. Down below, lost in the throng of petitioners and vassal lords, a woman the world had named plain and forgettable, an herbalist from a forgotten hollow, had just become the most dangerous person in the kingdom. He had built his reign on control, on the ice in his veins, on the brutal certainty of his will. But the scent wafting up to him, of crushed lavender, winter snow, and a magic he thought he had buried forever, was a memory he had sealed in blood and shadow 15 years ago. And for the first time since the old wars, his wolf, the beast he kept chained deep within his soul, rose up and howled a single, possessive word. Mine. If you believe a single scent can rewrite history, and that even the coldest heart can be thawed by a love it never knew it lost, type fated below. And let me tell you what happened next. To understand how she got there, you need to know that Verity had spent her entire life being beige. She was the color of dust on a forgotten shelf, the quiet hum beneath a roaring fire. In a world of wolves, of vibrant, vital shifters whose emotions painted the air, she was nothing. Human, they called her. Unscented, a pale shadow in the corner of every room. She was the apprentice to the healer of Blackwood Hollow, a village so small it was barely a nick in the vast, forested territory of the Alpha King. Her days were measured in the grinding of pestles, the steeping of herbs, and the quiet satisfaction of easing a cough or setting a small bone. She was useful, but she was not seen. Not really. The wound she carried was not one of flesh, but of invisibility. She watched the other girls her age, their scents blooming as they came into their power, attracting the attention of young wolves. She saw them laugh and flirt, their very presence a declaration. Hers was a question mark. The elders were kind but pitied her. The young ignored her. She was a ghost at the feast of life. Once a year, every village and hold sent their leaders to the great fortress of Stonefall to pay the tithe of fealty. It was a grand, terrible affair. Old Elspeth, Verity's master, was too frail to travel this year, and the village elder, a nervous man named Finn, had insisted Verity accompany him. He'd said, "Your knowledge of herbs might be needed, girl. The capital is a sickly place." But she knew the truth. He was afraid to go alone, and she was expendable enough to be his shield. The great hall of Stonefall was a cavern of noise and power. Smoke from a dozen fire pits spiraled up to a ceiling lost in shadow, catching on the antlers of colossal elk and the jawbones of long-dead beasts. The air was thick with the smells of roasting meat, spilled ale, and the potent, overwhelming scent of hundreds of dominant wolves packed together. It made Verity's head spin. She felt small and breakable, a field mouse in a den of lions. At the far end of the hall, on a throne that looked as if it had been ripped from the mountain itself, sat Alpha King Thane. He was not a man who simply sat. He commanded the very space he occupied. Even from this distance, Verity could feel the oppressive weight of his power. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in black leather and dark furs, his long, dark hair tied back from a face that was all hard angles and brutal authority. He had ruled for 2 decades, taking the throne after the devastating Shadow Wars that had nearly broken the northern pacts. He was said to be merciless. his heart frozen over by the horrors he had seen and the things he had done to end them. Finn trembled beside her, clutching their village's meager offering of dried herbs and smoked fish. Verity kept her eyes down, focusing on the cracks in the flagstones beneath her worn boots. Her mantra was simple: be invisible, be forgotten, survive the day. One by one, the lords and elders approached the throne, bowing low, their voices booming as they declared their loyalty. Thane watched them, his expression unreadable, his eyes a flat, cold gray. He would give a curt nod, his voice a low rumble of command that cut through the hall's din, and the next would approach. It was their turn. Finn shuffled forward, practically crawling. Verity followed a pace behind, her gaze fixed on the back of his woolen tunic. Finn knelt. He stammered out their village's name, his voice a pathetic squeak. Alpha King, Blackwood Hollow. We renew our fealty. Verity risked a glance upward, just for a second, and her breath caught. Up close, the Alpha King was even more terrifying. A jagged scar cut through his left eyebrow, a testament to a battle she couldn't imagine. But it was his eyes that held her. They weren't gray now. As his gaze flickered over Finn, and then, inevitably, to her, they seemed to shift, to deepen, like a storm gathering over the sea. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. He was about to dismiss them, another pair of gnats in his vast kingdom. She could feel the dismissal coming. And then it happened. A slight breeze, a draft from some high, unseen window, swirled down from the rafters. It stirred the dust, lifted the smoke, and carried the scent of the crushed lavender buds in her satchel, the clean smell of the soap she made herself, and something else, something she herself had never been able to smell, something that had been sleeping inside her for her entire life. Thane went still. It was not a human stillness. It was the absolute, lethal immobility of a wolf that has caught the scent of its prey, or its mate. The change was so sudden, so complete, that a wave of silence rolled out from the throne, extinguishing the noise of the hall as if he had swallowed it whole. Every head turned, every eye fixed on the dais. The king's head was tilted, just slightly. His nostrils flared, almost imperceptibly. His eyes, no longer gray, were now the color of molten gold, burning with a terrifying, focused intensity. And they were locked on her. Verity's blood ran cold. What had she done? Did she smell of some forbidden herb? Was there a flaw in their tithe? Finn was shaking so badly she could hear his teeth chattering. The king rose from his throne. He did not stand up. He unfolded, a fluid, menacing movement that promised violence. The two massive wolves that lay at the foot of his throne, beasts the size of ponies, lifted their heads, low growls rumbling in their chests. He ignored them. He ignored the gasps from his court. He ignored Finn, who now looked as if he might faint. He saw only her. He took a step down from the dais, then another. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was more frightening than any burst of speed. The crowd parted before him, a sea of powerful shifters falling back as if shoved by an invisible force. The world narrowed to the sound of his boots on the stone floor, a rhythmic, predatory beat that hammered in time with her own frantic heart. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she had to crane her neck to look up at him. The heat rolling off his body was like a furnace. He smelled of pine, cold iron, and the sharp, wild scent of an apex predator. He lowered his head, his face just inches from hers. The golden glow of his eyes was blinding. She could see the wolf just beneath his skin, a restless, powerful energy that made the air around him crackle. He breathed in a deep, slow inhalation that seemed to draw the very soul from her body. His eyes widened just for a second, with a look of raw, disbelieving shock. A whisper, rough as gravel and meant only for her, but in the dead silence of the hall it carried like a shout. "That scent. It's not possible." His gaze raked over her, from her plain braided hair to her worn leather boots. It was a look of such intensity she felt stripped bare. Every layer of her insignificance burned away. He wasn't seeing a plain, unscented girl. He was seeing something else entirely. He reached out, his hand, large and calloused, hovering near her face. The court held its breath. A king did not touch a commoner. An alpha did not touch an unscented human. His voice was a low growl, a mixture of fury, confusion, and something else. Something that sounded almost like pain. "I sealed you myself." And then his fingers, impossibly gentle, brushed against her temple. A jolt, white-hot and electric, shot through her. It was not a physical shock, but something deeper, a resonance in the very marrow of her bones. It felt like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for a lifetime. In that instant, she felt a dizzying pull toward him, an ache in her chest so profound it stole her breath. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It felt like coming home to a place she'd never known. The court erupted in a roar of confusion and outrage. "My lord!" One of his council, a silver-haired wolf with a cruel face, barked. "She is a nobody, a human." Thane did not even look at him. His golden eyes were still locked on Verity, searching her face for an answer she did not have. He spoke one word, his voice like the cracking of a glacier, absolute and final. "Mine." He curled his fingers around her upper arm. His grip was not brutal, but it was unbreakable. It was a claim. He turned, pulling her with him, and began walking back toward the dais. The crowd scrambled out of his way, their faces a mixture of fear and astonishment. "My king, what is the meaning of this?" the silver-haired lord demanded, stepping forward. Thane stopped. He turned his head slowly, and the look he gave the lord was so full of feral menace that the man physically recoiled. "The meaning, Lord Valerius," the king growled, his voice dropping to a lethal calm, "is that you will be silent, or I will silence you." He didn't wait for a reply. He tugged Verity along, pulling her up the steps of the dais, past the snarling wolves, and through a heavy iron-banded door behind the throne that she hadn't even noticed before. The door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing like a death knell. The noise of the great hall was cut off instantly, plunging them into the sudden, profound silence of stone and shadow. They were in a dark, cold corridor, lit only by narrow arrow slits high in the walls. The air was stale, tasting of dust and disuse. He did not let go of her arm. He led her deeper into the fortress, his long strides forcing her into a near run to keep up. They climbed a winding spiral staircase, the only sound their footsteps and her own ragged breathing. She was terrified, but a strange, defiant anger was beginning to burn through the fear. Who was this man to drag her away from her life, to claim her like a piece of property in front of the entire world? "Where are you taking me?" she demanded, her voice trembling but sharp. He didn't answer, didn't even slow down. He just kept climbing, his grip a manacle of warm leather and hard muscle around her arm. Finally, they reached a landing. A single heavy oak door stood before them, bound with rusted iron straps. It looked as though it hadn't been opened in a century. He released her arm to produce a massive, ornate iron key from a pouch on his belt. With a grating shriek of metal on metal, he turned the lock. He pushed the door open into a large, circular room. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of gray light, filtering down from a high, grime-covered window. The room was sparsely furnished. A heavy wooden bed covered in a dusty canvas sheet, a simple table and 2 chairs, a cold, cavernous fireplace. It was the top of a tower, a prison cell. He nudged her inside and followed, closing the door behind him. The heavy thud of the bolt sliding home sealed her fate. She was trapped. She spun to face him, her fear finally giving way to righteous fury. "What is this? What right do you have?" Thane stood with his back to the door, watching her. The feral, golden light had receded from his eyes, leaving them that cold, stormy gray again. He looked weary and profoundly conflicted. He raked a hand through his dark hair, the first sign of uncertainty she had seen in him. "Your scent," he said, his voice low and rough. "It should not exist. I made sure of it." "My scent?" she scoffed, wrapping her arms around herself. "I don't have a scent. I'm human. Everyone knows that." A humorless, bitter smile touched his lips. "No," he said softly, "you are not human." He walked past her to the grimy window, staring out at the vast, snow-dusted expanse of the northern wilderness. 15 years ago, the Shadow Fangs, a pack of blood mages and assassins, hunted down the last of the Cinderwood line. They were a powerful family, gifted with a rare and ancient magic. Earth callers. They could speak to the stone, move the soil, make flowers bloom in winter. The Fangs wanted that power, to twist it to their own dark purposes. He paused, his broad back a wall of black leather. "I was a general then, not yet king. My legion arrived too late. The hold was a slaughterhouse. We found no survivors, or so we thought." He turned from the window, his eyes pinning her in place. "In the rubble of the nursery, buried beneath a fallen beam, I found a child. A little girl no more than 5 years old. She was alive, but her magic was a beacon, screaming into the ether. The Fangs were still close. They would have found her within the hour." Verity's heart was hammering against her ribs. This was a story, a history lesson. It had nothing to do with her. It couldn't. "There was only one way to hide her," Thane continued, his voice dropping even lower. "A forbidden ritual, one that seals a shifter's true nature, cloaks their scent, and dampens their magic until it's undetectable. It turns them beige," he said, using her own word with a startling accuracy. "It makes them invisible. I performed the ritual myself. I poured my own blood, my own power, into the seal to make it unbreakable." He took a step toward her. "I gave the child to a trusted woodcutter and his wife in a remote village, a place no one would ever look. I told them she was an orphan from the wars, her family lost. I made them swear an oath of secrecy they would take to their graves. Then I left, and I never looked back. It was safer that way." He stopped, now only a few feet away. The intensity in his gaze was suffocating. "I sealed her so completely that even I would not be able to murmur. Her scent was gone. Her magic was asleep. She was safe." Verity shook her head, a denial forming on her lips, but no sound came out. Her mind was reeling, trying to piece together the impossible. The Cinderwood line. Earth callers. a 5-year-old girl. "But a seal like that has a flaw," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "One thing I never accounted for. One thing powerful enough to break a seal forged by an alpha's blood." He looked at her, and the look in his eyes was one of dawning, terrifying wonder. "A fated mate. The bond," he breathed. "It's the only explanation. Our proximity in the hall, the pull between us, it's tearing the seal apart from the inside. That scent of lavender and snow, that's not the smell of an herbalist, Verity. It's the scent of cinderwood magic. It's you." Waking up, the floor seemed to drop out from under her. Her entire life, her entire identity was a lie. The quiet, plain girl from Blackwood Hollow didn't exist. She was a ruin, a hidden princess, a piece of a story she had never known. And the man who had orchestrated it all was standing in front of her, the Alpha King himself, her jailer, and her fated mate. Would you have trusted the man who admitted he stole your memory and your magic, even if he said it was to save your life? Tell me in the comments. And if you are not subscribed yet, join this family. Verity stumbled back until her legs hit the edge of the cot. She sank onto it, the dusty canvas scratching her hands. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, you're lying. My parents, they died of the winter fever." "They were not your parents," Thane said, his voice gentle but firm. "They were your protectors, and they kept their oath." The room was spinning. She felt a phantom ache behind her eyes, a pressure building as if a dam was about to break. A memory, or the ghost of one, flickered at the edge of her consciousness. Fire, screaming, the smell of blood and burning wood. She flinched, pressing her palms to her temples. "I don't believe you," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. The pull in her chest, the undeniable resonance she'd felt when he touched her, was a truth her body understood even if her mind refused. "I know," he said quietly. He walked to the door, not to leave, but to retrieve something he had set down. He brought back a wooden tray. On it was a hunk of bread, a wedge of cheese, and a pewter cup of water. He set it on the small table. "Eat. You're in shock." She stared at the food, then back at him, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You lock me in a tower and expect me to have a pleasant meal?" "I brought you here to protect you," he countered, his voice losing its gentle edge and regaining its familiar tone of command. "Now that your scent is returning, the fangs will feel it, like blood in the water. This tower is warded. It is the safest place in the fortress." "Safe? Or imprisoned?" she shot back. His jaw tightened. "For now, they are the same thing." He turned and strode to the fireplace. With a grunt of effort, he hauled a massive log from a dusty pile and set it inside the hearth. He took a flint and steel from his belt and, with a few practiced strikes, coaxed a spark into a flame. The dry wood caught quickly, and a welcome warmth began to push back the chill of the room. He did not speak again. He moved to the far side of the room and settled into one of the wooden chairs, positioning it so he could watch both her and the door. He sat there, a silent, brooding sentinel, his presence filling the vast space. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind outside the tower. Verity sat on the bed, her mind a maelstrom. She replayed her entire life, searching for cracks in the story. The way Elspeth would sometimes look at her with a profound sadness. The fact that she had no baby things, no family heirlooms. The strange, recurring nightmare of a wolf with eyes of shadow. Hours passed. The light from the window faded from gray to a deep, bruised purple. The fire cast long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. Her stomach rumbled, a traitorous, mortal need. She glared at the food on the table, then at Thane. He hadn't moved a muscle. He was watching her with that unnerving stillness, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight. It was a battle of wills. She was determined not to give him the satisfaction of her obedience. But the hunger was a gnawing ache, and the shock had left her feeling hollow and weak. Finally, with a sigh of frustrated defeat, she stood up. She walked to the table, her movements stiff. She picked up the bread, her eyes daring him to say something. He remained silent, his expression unreadable. She took a bite. It was coarse and dry, but it was food. She ate it all, then the cheese, and drained the cup of water. When she was finished, she felt marginally more human. She placed the cup back on the tray with a decisive click. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice stronger. "Now," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We wait. We see how quickly your abilities return, and we prepare for the fangs to come hunting. And I'm just supposed to sit in this room?" "You are," he stated, not unkindly, "until I can be sure you are not a danger to yourself or others." That night, Verity lay on the cot, staring into the darkness. Thane had not left. He remained in the chair, a dark shape against the dying embers of the fire. She couldn't sleep. Her body was thrumming with a strange, new energy, a low-level vibration under her skin. The ache in her chest, the pull toward him, had intensified in the confines of the small room. It was a constant physical presence, like a string tied to her sternum, tugging her gently but relentlessly in his direction. She drifted into a restless doze, and the nightmares came. Not the usual vague shadows, but something sharper, more vivid. Fire. The snarling face of a wolf, its fur matted with blood. A woman's scream, her mother's scream, a man's shout, her father's. She saw a pair of gleaming black eyes, filled with a cold, hungry malice. She woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright. The room was cold, the fire long dead. But that wasn't what made her skin crawl. On the windowsill, a pot of withered, dead herbs she'd noticed earlier was now a riot of life. Green tendrils snaked up the stone, and in the pale moonlight, she could see they were covered in small, perfect, 5-petaled white flowers. Flowers that only bloomed in deep summer. It was the middle of autumn. A floorboard creaked. Thane was standing beside the bed, looking not at her, but at the pot on the windowsill. His face was grim. "It's starting," he said softly. She looked from the impossible blooms to his face, her heart pounding. I dreamed," she stammered, "of fire." He nodded slowly. "The seal didn't just hide you. It suppressed your memories of that night. As it weakens, they will return." He knelt beside the cot, bringing his face level with hers. The proximity sent another jolt of that unnerving energy through her. The cinderwood gift is tied to life, to the earth. Strong emotion can trigger it. Your fear, it made them grow. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment, before his fingers gently brushed her cheek, wiping away a tear she hadn't realized she'd shed. The touch was fire and ice. The bond between them flared, a sudden, searing heat in her chest that made her gasp. His eyes widened, the gray turning to molten gold in an instant. A low, involuntary growl rumbled in his chest. He snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. The bond, he rasped, his voice strained. He stood up abruptly and walked to the other side of the room, putting distance between them. He braced his hands against the cold stone wall, his back to her, his shoulders tense. "My wolf knew you," he said, the words sounding as if they were being torn from him. "In the hall, the moment your scent hit the air. Before my mind could comprehend it, the beast inside me knew its mate. It has been clawing to get to you ever since." It was a confession of staggering vulnerability from a man who seemed to have none. Verity stared at his rigid back, at the raw power held in check by sheer force of will. For the first time, she saw past the Alpha King, past the jailer, and saw the man. A man bound by the same invisible force that was currently turning her own world upside down. And in that moment, her fear was joined by a flicker of something else. Compassion. The days that followed fell into a strange rhythm. Thane spent most of his time in the tower with her. He said it was to guard her, but she knew it was also because the bond made it physically painful for him to be far from her. He would sit for hours, poring over maps and old texts, the lines of strain etched deep around his eyes. His council was in an uproar. He could hear their raised voices through the thick stone floor sometimes, their fury a palpable thing. Lord Valerius, in particular, was his most vocal opponent. "An unscented, unknown girl," he had roared in a council meeting Thane was forced to attend. "You shame your throne. You weaken the pack." Thane had returned to the tower that evening, looking more exhausted than she had ever seen him. The weight of his crown, of a lifetime of war and command, seemed to be crushing him. He slumped into his chair and rubbed his temples, a deep sigh escaping him. Without thinking, Verity went to her satchel of herbs she'd been allowed to keep. She took out chamomile and a sprig of lavender from the now thriving windowsill plant. She found a small pot, and using the water he brought her daily, brewed a tea over the fire. She carried the steaming cup to him. He looked up, his eyes wary. "It's just chamomile," she said softly. "It will help you rest." He stared at her for a long moment, then took the cup. His fingers brushed hers, and the familiar jolt passed between them. But this time it was softer, less jarring. He drank the tea, the tense lines of his shoulders relaxing slightly. "They think I have gone mad," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of its usual command. "They see you as a weakness, a human distraction." "Am I?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked from the cup to her face, and his eyes were clear gray, filled with a weary honesty. "You are the most dangerous thing that has ever happened to me," he admitted. "But you are not a weakness." It was in these small moments that the walls between them began to crumble. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his mood, the tightening of his jaw that meant his counsel was testing his patience, the far-off look in his eyes that meant he was thinking of the wars. He, in turn, watched the steady blossoming of her power with a kind of grim fascination. She learned to control it, just a little. She could make the small pot of herbs on the windowsill bloom or wither with a thought. She discovered that if she pressed her hand to the cold stone of the tower, she could feel the deep, slow pulse of the mountain beneath them. It felt ancient and powerful, a song she was just beginning to learn the words to. One afternoon, he was teaching her about the Shadow Fangs, sketching out their sigil, a snarling wolf's head wreathed in thorns, on a piece of parchment. "Their alpha, Malachor, is the one who led the attack on your family," Thane explained, his voice grim. He is cunning and utterly without honor. He will not stop until he has your magic. As he spoke the name Malachor, a searing pain shot through Verity's head. An image flashed behind her eyes. The sigil he had just drawn, tattooed on the back of a large, pale hand that was reaching for her. She cried out and stumbled back, knocking the table. The inkpot went flying. Before it could hit the floor, Thane moved. He wasn't just fast. He was a blur of motion, inhumanly quick. He crossed the room in a single heartbeat, one hand catching the inkpot mid-air, while the other wrapped around her waist to steady her, pulling her back against his chest. The world stopped. Her back was flush against the hard wall of his body. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her shoulder blades. His arm was a band of steel and fire around her, and his scent, pine and winter air and pure, undiluted wolf, enveloped her completely. The ache of the bond, the constant, low-grade pull, exploded into a wave of intense, undeniable need. It was a hunger she hadn't known she possessed. She tilted her head back, and her hair brushed against his jaw. He was looking down at her, his eyes blazing gold. The wolf was right there, at the surface, staring out of his eyes. A low growl vibrated through his chest and into her body. It wasn't a threat. It was possessive. It was primal. "Verity," he breathed. Her name a prayer and a curse. Slowly, he lowered his head. She watched, mesmerized, as his lips descended toward hers. This was it, the culmination of weeks of shared confinement, of silent battles and quiet truces. It was terrifying and inevitable. She didn't pull away. She rose on her toes, meeting him halfway. Just as their lips were about to touch, a horn blast, sharp and frantic, echoed from the courtyard far below. Thane stiffened. The gold in his eyes receded, replaced by the cold, hard focus of a commander. He released her, stepping back, and the loss of his warmth was a physical blow. "What is that?" she asked, her voice shaky. He was already at the window, peering down. His body went rigid. "Scouts!" he bit out, his voice a low, dangerous snarl. "On the edge of the Blackwood. They've found signs." He turned to her, and the Alpha King was back, all traces of the vulnerable man gone. "Malachor's wolves! They're hunting! They've sensed you!" A cold dread washed over her, but it was quickly followed by a hot surge of anger. They were coming for her. The monsters from her nightmares were real, and they were coming to finish the job. Thane was already moving, his mind clearly racing. "I'll double the wards. We'll move you to the deep vaults." "No," she said. He stopped, turning to her with a look of disbelief. "What?" "No," she repeated, her voice stronger, firmer than she had ever heard it. She stepped forward, planting her feet. "You will not hide me in a hole. You will not seal me away again. I am not that little girl in the rubble anymore." He stared at her, his expression a mixture of shock and fury. "This is not a debate, Verity. You are not a warrior. You are the one thing they want, and I will not risk you. You will risk losing everything if you sideline me," she shot back, surprising herself with her own audacity. "You said it yourself. My magic is tied to the earth, to stone." She walked to the wall of the tower and pressed her palm flat against it. She closed her eyes, shutting out his commanding presence, and focused. She reached for the deep, slow pulse of the mountain she had felt before. She didn't ask. She pulled. A low, grinding groan echoed through the room. Thane took a step back, his eyes wide. Dust rained down from the ceiling. On the wall where her hand rested, the mortar between the ancient stones began to glow with a faint, green light. The stones themselves seemed to shift, settling into a tighter, stronger bond. The very foundation of the tower hummed with a power it hadn't known for centuries. She opened her eyes, breathless from the effort, but filled with a fierce, triumphant energy. "I am not a liability," she said, her voice ringing with newfound power. "I am the lady of this stone keep. They want to tear down my walls? Let them try." Thane stared at her, at the glowing wall, at the undeniable power radiating from her. The shock on his face slowly morphed into something else: awe, and a fierce, dangerous pride. A slow, wolfish grin spread across his face. It was the first time she had ever seen him smile. "So be it," he rumbled. "You will stand with me." The attack came 3 nights later, on the new moon. The horns blew their desperate warning just after midnight, a sound that sliced through the frigid air. From her window at the top of the east tower, Verity could see them. Shadows, flitting between the trees at the edge of the clearing, their eyes glowing with an unnatural red light. The Shadow Fangs. Thane was a whirlwind of controlled fury. He was no longer her conflicted guardian. He was the Alpha King, the Wolf Lord of the North, in his element. He burst into her room, already clad in battle leathers, a greatsword strapped to his back. "They're trying to draw our warriors out," he said, his voice clipped and precise. "Malakor's shamans will target the tower. They know you're here. They will try to bring it down." Fear, cold and sharp, tried to grip her, but then she felt the deep, steady hum of the stone beneath her feet, her stone, her keep, and the fear was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "I'll be ready," she said. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in his eyes she saw not a man looking at a charge to be protected, but a warrior looking at his shield maiden. He nodded once, a gesture of absolute trust. "Hold the line, Verity." Then he was gone, his heavy boots thundering down the stairs to lead the defense. Verity went to the center of the room and knelt, pressing both palms to the floor. She closed her eyes and reached out with her mind, with her very essence. She felt the foundation of the tower, the deep roots of it sunk into the mountain's heart. She felt every stone, every crack, every grain of mortar. It was a part of her now. The assault began. Below, she heard the clash of steel, the snarls of fighting wolves, the guttural shouts of men. And then she felt it. A vile, corrupting magic pressing against the outer walls of the tower. It felt like rot, like disease. The shamans, the stone beneath her hands, groaned in protest. Cracks began to spiderweb across the floor. She poured her own energy into the walls, her will against theirs. She pictured the mortar turning to iron, the stones locking together, the foundation becoming one with the mountain's core. The green light flared around her, filling the room, pulsing in time with her heart. A massive impact shook the tower, nearly throwing her off balance. They were using a battering ram imbued with dark magic. Another impact, and a section of the outer wall on a lower level exploded inward. She cried out, feeling the tower's wound as if it were her own. "No," she thought, a fierce primal rage surging through her. "You will not have my home." She pushed back with everything she had. She didn't just defend, she attacked. She commanded the fallen stones to reform, to fly back into the breach with violent force. She heard cries of pain and surprise from below. She didn't stop. She sent a wave of power down through the foundation, and outside, at the base of the tower, the very earth erupted. spikes of solid rock, sharp as spears, thrust up from the ground, impaling two of the shamans who were chanting there. The magical assault faltered. She had hurt them. She had surprised them. But Malakor was not so easily deterred. A new presence, one of immense power and chilling malice, focused on her. It was him, the wolf from her nightmares. His power slammed into her mind, a psychic blow that sent her reeling. Images flooded her vision. Her mother's terrified face, her father's defiant last stand, the glint of Malakor's blade. "I took them from you, little bird." His voice echoed in her head, oily and triumphant. "And now I will take your power. You should have stayed hidden." "I'm not hiding anymore," she snarled, speaking the words aloud into the empty room. She gathered her will, her grief, her rage, and the deep, abiding strength of the mountain. She met his mental attack with a wall of pure, unyielding stone. He recoiled, his power scraping against her defenses like claws on granite. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity. Down below, Thane and his wolves were a whirlwind of righteous fury, driving the Fangs back from the main gates. In the tower, Verity was a silent, immovable fortress, her will the only thing keeping the ancient stones from crumbling to dust. Finally, with a great, coordinated push, Thane's warriors broke the enemy line. The Shadow Fangs, their shamans dead or broken, lost their nerve. They fled back into the darkness, their alpha's psychic presence vanishing with a final curse of hatred. Silence fell, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the crackling of fires. Verity collapsed, her strength utterly spent. The green glow faded from the room. She lay on the cold stone floor, gasping for breath, her body trembling with exhaustion. But she was alive. The tower was standing. She had held the line. Heavy running footsteps echoed on the stairs. The door burst open. Thane stood there, his face smeared with dirt and blood, his sword dripping. His golden eyes swept the room, saw the cracks and the dust, and then found her on the floor. He was across the room in 2 strides, kneeling beside her, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch. "Verity, are you hurt?" She managed a weak smile. "The tower still stands," she whispered. Relief, so profound it was almost painful, washed over his face. He let out a shuddering breath and gently, so gently, gathered her into his arms. He held her against his chest, his face buried in her hair. "You did it," he murmured, his voice thick with awe and emotion. "By the spirits, you did it." He carried her down from the tower, not to hide her, but to show her. He strode into the great hall, which was now a makeshift infirmary, filled with weary, wounded warriors. As he entered, carrying her, a hush fell over the room. Every wolf, from the lowest soldier to the highest-ranking lord, turned to look. They saw their alpha king, stained with the blood of their enemies, holding the girl they had dismissed as a human nobody. They saw the still glowing embers of power in her eyes and the defiant set of her jaw. They saw the way their king looked at her, with a reverence and pride that eclipsed his authority. Lord Valerius was there, his arm in a sling. He stared, his mouth agape, as Thane walked to the center of the hall. Thane did not put her down. He held her as he addressed his people, his voice ringing with power and certainty. "Tonight, the Shadow Fangs sought to tear down our walls. They failed. They failed because these walls have a new master." He looked down at Verity, his gaze softening. "This is Verity of the Cinderwood line, the last of her blood. The woman you called human, the one you scorned, held the East Tower alone against Malakor's magic. She is the stone in our foundation. She is the fire in our heart. He looked back at his stunned court. She is my fated mate, and she is your queen. A collective gasp went through the hall. Thane ignored it. He lowered his head, and in front of the entire pack, he kissed her. It was not a gentle, questioning kiss like the one they had almost shared. It was a claiming, a public, undeniable declaration of a bond forged in secret and proven in battle. It was fire and stone, wolf and earth, a promise and a seal all in one. And as he kissed her, Verity felt the last vestiges of the old seal inside her shatter completely. A wave of pure, clean power washed through her, healing her exhaustion, filling her with a strength she had never dreamed of. In that moment, in the arms of her king, surrounded by the pack that had once overlooked her, Verity was finally, truly, seen. The invisible girl was gone forever. In her place stood a queen. 6 months later, the first snows of true winter blanketed the northern peaks. The East Tower was no longer a prison, but their home. The circular room at the top had been transformed. Rich tapestries now covered the walls, depicting the history of the Cinderwood line, and the furniture was of polished dark wood. And in the center of the room, growing from a massive stone-carved basin, was a garden that defied the seasons. Winter roses and starlit moss bloomed in a riot of impossible color, a living testament to the woman who tended them. Verity was humming softly to herself, trimming a vine that had crept a little too far, when the door opened. Thane entered, shedding his heavy cloak of black fur. He had just come from a long, arduous meeting with the vassal lords, and the familiar lines of strain were etched around his eyes. The weight of the crown was a constant burden. He paused, just watching her for a moment. He loved these moments, when she was lost in her own world, her power a gentle, life-giving hum in the air instead of a weapon of war. She looked up and smiled, and the weariness in his face lessened instantly. "A hard day, my king?" she asked softly. He crossed the room to her and sighed, letting his forehead rest against hers. "They are wolves, my love," he rumbled. "They are always squabbling over something." He breathed in her scent, lavender and snow and the rich, clean smell of living earth. It was the scent that had undone him, the scent that had remade him. It was the scent of home. She reached up, her fingers tracing the scar over his eyebrow. Her touch was no longer a jolt of shocking energy, but a steady, familiar warmth that seeped into his very bones, soothing the ever-present beast within him. Under her hand, he felt the last of his tension melt away. "Let them squabble," she whispered, her lips brushing his. "The stone is strong, the pack is safe, and their king is home." He captured her mouth in a slow, deep kiss that spoke of quiet contentment and a love that had been strong enough to rewrite their past and forge their future. He was no longer just the cold, hard alpha king, and she was no longer the forgotten girl. They were Thane and Verity, the wolf and the stone, and together they were whole. For more stories where a fated love conquers the burdens of the past, and where hidden strength becomes a queen's power, subscribe to His Wolf Knew First. So tell me, would you have stayed? Comment where you are listening from tonight. I stay up until my eyes burn to bring you these stories. If this one touched you, do not break my heart. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.